In just a few hours from now, Joe, Washington is going to look a lot different than it has over the past 2 years. House Democrats, armed with subpoena power and newfound political capital, plan to hold President Trump to account. It is a divided government, which this morning remains partly shut down for the 13th straight day, and the standoff could last for weeks. So frame this moment for us.
Well, if you just take a snapshot of what today looks like, it would be very easy to say that this is the crossing of two paths, the coming not only Democratic majority, but coming Democratic dominance in American politics. You've got the Republicans on the run. You've got Donald Trump right now being even more irrational than before, even more bizarre than before. So much so that there are two editorials in the Wall Street Journal editorial page questioning his fitness for office. One, in fact, suggesting that the question is being raised more and more in their circles whether Americans can put up with much more of this after Donald Trump serves out his first term. That comes with a huge asterisk. Because, of course, we remember when Donald Trump first launched his campaign in June of 2015, him sitting at 2%. I remember when we got elected in 1994, the U.S. News and World Report cover that showed a picture of a dying Democratic Party saying, "Is this the end of two-party rule?" I remember Barack Obama being elected in 2008 and hearing about the permanent Obama coalition, which lasted 2 years. So I guess what I'm saying is, if you just take a snapshot of today, it looks like Trump is down, Trumpism is going down, and will not recover. There are a lot of reasons to believe that is the case. But we always have to be wary of making snap judgments based on a day. But
that is for sure.
One thing is for sure, Mika. Today, Nancy Pelosi will be sworn in as Speaker of the House for the second time. The first time, of course, in 2007, and now again in 2019. And we will see exactly what happens, what lessons that Democratic majority learned from their first 4 years in office, and what challenges that's going to bring for Donald Trump. I suspect those challenges are going to be great.
Well, yesterday marked President Trump's first cabinet meeting of the new year. And as the New York Times, Eric Lipton points out, the Department of Defense is now run by a longtime executive at Boeing, one of the largest defense contractors in the world. The EPA is being run by a former coal lobbyist. The Department of Health and Human Services is being run by a former pharmaceutical lobbyist. And the Department of Interior has a former oil industry lobbyist as its acting secretary, not to mention the acting chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, and acting Attorney General Matthew Whitaker, who yesterday launched into praise of the president. It's that loyalty oath.
Sir, Mr. President, I will start by highlighting the fact that you stayed in Washington, D.C. over the holidays, giving up Christmas with your family, New Year's with your family, trying to bring an end to this shutdown and security to our southern border. You have demonstrated your dedication to delivering on this critical issue for our country and for the American people.
Wow.
No, it's unbelievable. I want to show a couple other clips from there and then get a response from our panel, especially David Ignatius, on some of these foreign policy issues. During the cabinet meeting, Donald Trump seemed to become the first president of the United States to ever endorse the 1979 invasion of Afghanistan.
We are talking to the Taliban. We're talking to a lot of different people. But here's the thing, because you mentioned India. India is there. Russia is there. Russia used to be the Soviet Union. Afghanistan made it Russia because they went bankrupt fighting in Afghanistan. Russia. And the reason Russia was in Afghanistan was because terrorists were going into Russia. They were right to be there. The problem is it was a tough fight. And literally they went bankrupt. They went into being called Russia again as opposed to the Soviet Union. You know, a lot of A lot of these places you're reading about now are no longer part of Russia because of Afghanistan. But why isn't Russia there? Why isn't India there? Why isn't Pakistan there? Why are we there? We're 6,000 miles away.
Actually, literally, he's literally wrong. It was not Afghanistan that bankrupted the Soviet Union. It was a collection of terrible mistakes, tragic mistakes over 74 years. It was purges where up to 30 million Russians were killed by their own government. It was forced famines. In Ukraine, it was a collection of things. It was every president, actually, and this is relevant, David Ignatius, for Donald Trump. It was every president from Harry S. Truman, starting at around late 1946, early 1947, to Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush in 1991, Christmas Day, when the Soviet Union finally fell. It was a collection of their policies that Donald Trump is dismantling that actually brought the Soviet Union to their knees, getting a history lesson from a man who is now tearing asunder those policies that actually did destroy what evil empire, Ronald Reagan called the evil empire, is quite rich in early 2019 .
Well, happy New Year get the president's history lesson.
Wow.
There were many, to me, cringeworthy moments in that first cabinet meeting. The sycophancy of his acting attorney general was one. Having the president sitting in front of a huge poster of himself was another. He clearly has no understanding of the idea that has driven, as you say, Joe, every administration since Harry Truman, that American power in the world is a force that makes us stronger, safer, more prosperous, that our network of alliances, relationships, the commitments we make to people are at the heart of American power. The president doesn't see that. He wants to pull back, let others do it. He's almost inviting the Russians to come back. So the history lesson about Afghanistan was just one small piece of this way he has of thinking about America first. I've been talking with people who are really, I don't think to say they're reeling is overstating it, from governments around the world, from members of our own military who are seeing the guardrails in this first week of the new year being taken off as General Mattis leaves as Secretary of Defense, as John Kelly leaves as White House Chief of Staff. The people who the world sees as having bounded some of the president's instincts are leaving, and there's real anxiety about what's ahead. People try to understand, what is American policy in Syria? What are we trying to do in Afghanistan? How long are we staying in these places? And people who I talked to just kind of shrug their shoulders. One said to me last night, you know, we just have to reckon with the reality that America is less important in the world than it's been for a long while. And that's worrying.
David, let's take a look at what the president said about Syria, and I want to follow up with you on that.
Look, we don't want Syria. Obama gave up Syria years ago when he didn't violate the red line. I did when I shot 59 missiles in. So Syria was lost long ago. It was lost long ago. And besides that, I don't want, we're talking about sand and death. That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about, you know, vast wealth. We're talking about sand and death.
First of all, David, as you know better than most reporters in Washington, D.C., Syria wasn't lost years ago. In fact, our 2,500 men and women are doing a hell of a job there right now. Could you talk about the fact that the commander-in-chief sees a country like Syria, the situation, the theater where we are right now, as nothing more than sand but death? And can you explain to our viewers how what the president's doing is giving Russia a foothold in the Middle East, giving Iran a chance to be an existential threat to Israel by arming terrorists who will kill Israelis day in and day out, and finally resurrect ISIS and other terror groups that decide to pour into that void?
Joe, it's simple and tragic. When our president, commander-in-chief, describes this country, which has been a crucial test of wills between different regional players, as simply sin and death, he's essentially folding our hand and requiring the people of that region to look elsewhere for solutions, to look elsewhere to fill the vacuum. And they're doing that. The Kurds, who until a couple of weeks ago depended on us as faithful allies in stabilizing northeastern Syria, as you say, successfully are now, because they have no other choice, turning to the Russians and to the Syrian regime and trying to cut a deal. I think President Trump has this notion that Turkey is going to be the stabilizing force in northern Syria. That ain't going to happen. There's been a lot of evidence to test that proposition, and that's not going to happen. But it's just to see the American power, which had been successful at low cost in destroying ISIS and stabilizing that part of the country, being destabilized by the president pretty much willy-nilly against the objections of his Secretary of Defense, his Secretary of State, his Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. You cannot find anyone, basically, in the senior ranks of government who doesn't think he made a mistake on Syria. It's just tough to watch.
It's hard to watch.
And not only is that tough to watch, and it's tragic. Mike Barnicle, much of what he said yesterday was complete and utter nonsense. What he said about Afghanistan, what he said about Syria, what he said about generals trashing the greatest generals of the past generation actually is so dangerous on so many fronts. But I want to read for you what how Ann Guerin described yesterday's meeting in the Washington Post. 95 minutes of outright lies. I added lies. She said falsehoods. Revisionist history and self-aggrandizement. Then, of course, we saw the praise from toadies. And again, something deeply offensive. Maybe draft dodger doesn't fit his circumstances perfectly, but I think most Americans would consider what he did draft dodging. He's draft dodging back during the Vietnam War while Robert Mueller is working for a year to fix his knee so he can go fight in Vietnam. And then you've got people like General Mattis and Stan McChrystal and William McRaven, who have put their lives on the line for a generation in service and defense of our republic. And you have that man in the White House attacking them.
Yeah, Joe, and you know, that man in the White House, when it came to a confrontation that he felt had to be resolved quickly in order to get Jim Mattis out of the Office of Secretary of Defense on January 1st rather than February 1st, he had Mike Pompeo, his Secretary of State, call Jim Mattis because he was probably afraid to call General Mattis. But, you know, I'm aligned with David Ignatius here in the sense that for the past 3 days I've spoken to half a dozen people who were members of prior administrations and one who is still with this administration. And the theme was the same about this president when they were discussing him. They felt there was a line of astoundingly ignorant and astoundingly isolated and dangerous incidents involving this president, who for 2 weeks has been in basically isolation, and he appears yesterday finally bursting at the seams to talk. And every one of the people that I spoke to had one theme in common. They indicated they had been called by members of governments in other nations used to dealing with a sensible, sane, and safe United States of America, asking them what was going on, how long did they anticipate what was going on now would last, and did people here in this administration realize the risk and the heightened danger they were bringing by this erratic behavior. That was the common theme.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.